Ladies and gentlemen, I think this part of the proceedings will be slightly different from the previous one, in the sense that the previous one had the considered views of the distinguished members and were considered, so to speak, and had been decided before they arrived. We would like, I'm told, and it would be good if it happened, a more interactive session for the next 45 minutes and maybe more. And if we can have that, I would certainly be pleased, because I'm always much more comfortable in an interactive session than in one in which I just talk to slides. I must make an apology, though it's not my fault, that I picked up a throat virus about a week ago, and despite all the attempts of Indian medicine to get rid of it, it's only about half got rid of. So I hope that in the next 45 minutes my voice won't give out. If it does give out, I have a colleague who knows everything I'm going to say anyway, and he can take over. But I suspect that won't be necessary, or rather I hope that it won't. The colleague is walking past now. So what I'm going to do is to talk about skill development and also put a little bit of a twist on it, coming, I think, from Oxford and from the way in which we are concerned not just in skills, but, if you like, in excellence, which we tend to like to call it, which means aiming at more than just a skill, but doing things in the best possible way. And they're not necessarily, aspirationally, exactly the same. Hopefully the first slide is up now, but I can't see it, so we'll see how this works. You have a picture of India. I suspect most of you know about India anyway, so I won't worry too much about that one. But as you know, you're a very successful subcontinent. Personally, having looked at the size of India, I think you should be renominated a continent. You're bigger than Europe, for goodness sake, and they give it a continent. Hardly anybody lives in Antarctica, and they're a continent. So, nevertheless, you're a subcontinent in most of the books I've read. You're growing fast, not as fast as you thought you would about a year ago, but if we in Britain had a growth rate of about 4.5, I think we'd be extremely happy. So, there will be, of course, problems when aspirations don't quite meet forecasts, and there will be problems of unemployment, but I suspect compared with those that we have in the rapidly aging Western world, your problems are nothing like as big as ours. So, we're talking about skills. Well, being an academic, I guess the first thing you do is to try and define what you're talking about. And rather than looking at Wikipedia, I just thought my way into what is a skill. And my concept of a skill is that it's an ability that enables you to reach an intended outcome in a repeatable way. Now, all of that is quite important in the sense that it must be repeatable, because if you do something and it works, and then you do it again and it doesn't work, then maybe it was just luck the first time. So you need to be able to do something in a regular sort of way and know that you are actually bringing to bear something that is different from just playing cards and the chance of the way in which the dice falls or whatever. So if we agree that that's a reasonable definition of a skill, how would you analyze skills? Well, they can be divided into two, one of which we call domain-specific skills. Domain-specific skills you see in medicine, you see it in engineering. If from exercising your skill, you're capable of healing somebody, or alternatively, in engineering, from building a bridge, then perhaps you've got some skill in that area. The other ones are domain general skills. Now, domain general skills are rather different, and they're the ones that people generally have to deal with in business schools, whereas in schools of medicine, of course, and engineering, you're more concerned with specific skills. Domain general skills would be exampled with planning, control, or management. These enable people to run things effectively and efficiently. The third bit is technology. Now, technology, of course, has an impact upon the skills that are needed, and it isn't always good, particularly if you've got a large labor force. Changes in the nature of skills, technology changes the nature of skills needed for domain-specific skills required to achieve a given outcome. So if you were in IT, you would be able to achieve far, far more with far less skill now than you would have done, say, 30 years ago. It's likely, therefore, to lead to job losses as technology replaces labor. And whereas all of us would be in favor of pushing technology through the boundaries that it's currently in, we then have to look at the other side and say, yeah, but if we have it in every industry, then we have a real problem in terms of keeping everybody employed. So we've got to have some sort of a balance that way. On the other hand, if we go for labor-dominated industries and eschew the technology, then other countries will go past us. So it can be a problem in terms of domain-specific skills. It may help enable domain general skills to be made easier. Technology may. If you're in charge of a global company, 30 years ago you needed sub-offices all around the world. Nowadays, because of ICT, you can often find out everything that you need to find from one head office, and you can have much lighter involvement and presence in other parts of the world. So it helps in that way. For those of you who operate in business schools, you will note, if you do strategy, which is my area, that all this is rather similar to the concept of core competencies. Core competencies are really domain-specific skills, and dynamic capabilities, which are, of course, the generalized skills that enable you to adjust yourself to the way in which the world is operating and still have a sustainable business. So we're not really dealing with something new and unique, but something that we have to operate in relation to when we are running a business. We need the skills, the domain-specific ones, to do the business well, but we also need the general ones to be able to run it effectively. Technology change, of course, will come about, and we see that on an annual basis at least. It is either productivity enhancing, namely it makes you able to turn out more product, more service for the same input, more gallons from a car engine, let's say, or it could be disruptive in the process. For instance, changing a car from petrol-driven one to a hydrogen-driven one. That will destroy all the guys who made quite a good business out of selling petrol and producing the sort of parts for a car that it needs in order to be petrol-driven. Suddenly they disappear, and with dynamic capabilities, we have to redevelop under the new technology. This also, of course, applies to skills. Technology often makes skill redundant. For instance, handwriting is pretty well made redundant by the word processor. Since my handwriting was always pretty bad, I'm quite pleased about that. So, why do we need in a country a skills strategy? Well, we have the formal jobs and income of the mass of the population in an orthodox way, and that is the way in which GDP is put together. Small and medium-sized enterprises are part of that, and a very important part of that, because they are often the nucleus of the growth potential of a country. And then, of course, there is unemployment, and we need economic growth and social development from the unemployed. The formal sector must grow by becoming more productive, competitive, and generating more jobs. The SME growth must grow by developing more SMEs, and the development sector, by which we mean infrastructure, government, and all those NGOs that are supposed to help the economy generally, they must support improved subsistence as well as lay the basis for SMEs and the formal sector. in the formal sector, skills must complement the initiatives, and sometimes they can even lead the way. But skills don't make jobs necessarily. As I've already said, ICT can easily lead to the loss of jobs. So we have to be aware of that, but not be too dominated by it. On the SME side, there's a whole range of initiatives that are important. There's microcredit for small companies, and this in the developing world has grown to be quite important. There is technology support in many parts of the country and from specific private companies providing services. Business support, marketing and export, skill development, all of these are available to help SMEs, but in my experience, not enough. The British government is always saying they're in favour of helping SMEs, but since I'm involved in an SME myself, I've never noticed it. I don't think the government cares at all about SMEs, it cares about big business. That's wrong. It should care about SMEs because, as I said earlier, that's where the growth in the potential for the country very frequently comes from. There's also the importance of focusing on developing human resources. Countries that get addicted to selling their natural resources rarely develop their human resources and the educational and innovative companies that go with that. So after the ore has been mined, the trees cut and the oil pumped, their people are actually even more behind. Now that's a very significant comment made by Thomas Friedman. Many of you, most of you I hope, will have read his book about the world becoming flat. For those who haven't, I would assure you he's not a Luddite. He's not something that believes that the world really is flat. What he does believe is if you invent something in Los Angeles, they'll know about it in Tokyo within 24 hours, and in Delhi, and in London probably. So there is great difficulty, almost impossibility, of actually keeping ahead in terms of development because they will be imitated and possibly improved upon in no time at all. And the thought that he's making here is making sure that the developing world is not exploited as it has been in the past, and actually is up there with the development of sustainable companies in a way in which they keep at the boundaries of technological possibility rather than just have their raw materials taken from them. So what are the challenges? Well, social appreciation of skills as a livelihood asset is important, and I'm absolutely sure that this conference is very well aware of that, and it's already been emphasized several times by the speakers already. Linking education to employability, again, that has been mentioned both by me and earlier speakers, and it is a problem. If you look at it at an extreme, you could say that we will be so good at inventing microchipped applications, we'd hardly need anybody in our factories. We just need a guy in the morning to come in, switch it all on. It'll turn out what we expected it to for that day, get shipped off, and that's it. Now, we're not at that extreme, but we do have robots in factories, which means we need less people for making cars. And the way in which people get replaced by electronic means is clearly a threat to the developing world, because one of the key advantages of the developing world has been in low-cost labor. Now, it isn't as you get more developed, because as we look in Japan, for example, or Tokyo, or Korea, you will see that wages go up and you don't stay a low-wage economy all that long. On the other hand, if it's the great advantage that the developing world has, then the greater the degree of electronics taken over, the less we have of that advantage. So we can't say, yes, they make the things in an electronic way, we're not worried about that. We would be worried about the unemployment. So there's no one solution to this dynamic and evolutionary way in which things are happening. Every region, every country has to look at its own situation and in a balanced way see how they can keep employment up and also stay at the forefront of technology. and building the skills that are relevant to now, not relevant to the past. Globalization is talked about a lot, and it's probably got many, many definitions. The International Monetary Fund defines it as a complex series of economic, social, technological, cultural and political changes that are increasing interdependence. And the word interdependence is crucial to that little quote, because in a globalized world, we are all interdependent to a very large degree. Also, integration and interaction between peoples and companies in disparate locations. As I say, there are many definitions of globalization, but that's the one that really emphasizes that we are working in a global world, and when we're setting standards, and setting standards in particular, I would say, for business schools and for universities, then those standards must be standards of excellence in terms of the world rather than in terms of your country. If I may be a little bit critical there, I think the Indian government's attitude to keeping out world universities and building beneath some sort of protectionist barriers is a totally bad thing. I can see why they might want to do that. On the other hand, if you're going to become a world operator, then we have to operate in the Indian universities according to world standards. India does, of course, have numerous advantages. Its demographic is Indians are young, a very large percentage are under 35. You speak the English language and many other languages as well, which is a great advantage over people like myself from the West. You're pretty good in terms of quantification, far better than we are in the West. You have a very credible IT image that probably goes with that, and you've got a steady growth trajectory over the last decade or so, and long may it continue. You'll see from the next slide that you have an enormous advantage in terms of the young population, and that will enable you to provide people on a global basis, not just on an Indian basis, for being at the forefront of what is likely to happen to the world economy over the next decade. The centers of economic activity will shift inevitably, as they have done over the last few decades, not just globally but also regionally. What you've been good at doing for the last few decades may change. It'll shift within regions, and you'll see it happening, and you have to be an early observer to be able to react to it. Today, Asia accounts for 13% of world GDP, says McKinsey Quarterly, but it wrote that in 2006. In fact, I've done a calculation, and nowadays it's more like 25%. See how rapidly this as well will begin to overtake the a unique opportunity. The world needs most, that's productive workers, and I've talked about that extensively. That will of course continue, but it'll only continue for a time, because productivity will relate, I suspect, more to electronics than to having numbers of people. It will provide also the investment opportunities for an aging population, that's us, the Westerners, to earn high levels of post-retirement incomes. Well, if I'm still around by then, I would very much like that to be the case. Skills are in fact a global currency, and you have many of that currency already. Countries with a significant skills capital can innovate and remain competitive and enable sustainable growth to come about. Skills development will create inclusive societies. We must hope. That is a belief more than a certainty. It may well be that particular skills will enable an aristocracy, the aristocracy of IT, perhaps to develop. But let's hope it will actually create inclusive societies. And global skills development should be added as a United Nations Millennium Goal. We have one of the cliches developed the media, a full-colour workforce at play in India. Firstly, the white collar. Well, everybody knows what the white collar workforce is. Then the grey collar, which is the knowledge worker, the ICT guys, problem solving, analytical and effective communication skills. You have the blue collar, which will probably be reducing in size, shop floor work in the manufacturing and service sector. That's where things tend to be taken over by electronics to some extent, or by robots. And fourthly, the new one that I hadn't heard of until I did a bit of research into this, the rust collar, which is skilled workers at grassroots level in currently unorganized and unbenchmarked sectors like construction, agriculture and related change. I guess that must apply not just to those areas, but also to the masses, the millions in rural India, which as rural India comes out of being rural in that sense, must be an important source of skills opportunity for the future in a developed nation. Now let me say a thing about Indian universities, because that's a thing I'm increasingly becoming concerned with. My colleague Dishant in the front row and I have developed an organization that will relate to Indian universities for the following reasons. Indian universities, I'm told from an article I read given at a conference in Boston 10 years ago, were encouraged by the British Raj to communicate established knowledge. Well, that's fine as far as it goes, and in terms of skill development, established knowledge is obviously vital. However, the British Raj did not encourage the development of new knowledge because they were concerned to build an Indian civil service and the Indian manufacturing sector that would take their orders from their imperial masters. Now, all of that is at least 50 or 60 years gone, but the mindset that says we in universities are about communicating knowledge rather than specifically creating and developing new knowledge is, as I read it, and in some of my experience of Indian universities, still there. The need, if you're doing a degree in India, to contribute new ideas is seen far, far less than in my university, which is Oxford. Now, Oxford always appears at the top of the table, or if not second or third, of the universities on the world table. Now, why is that? I don't think it's because people are necessarily more intellectually brilliant, although they probably claim they are, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. But when I first arrived in Oxford as a young undergraduate, a very long time ago, and I was asked to write an essay, I went and read about it and fed back the received opinion on whatever that essay was set at. And my tutor looked at me and he said, well, you've really written something that could be a leader for The Economist. And I preened myself and thought, aren't I clever? And he said, no, I'm not meaning that as a compliment. I mean, you've given me a bunch of superficial platitudes that everybody knows anyway if they bother to read the papers. You come to Oxford to think, and when you write an essay for me, if there's nothing in there that shows that you've thought rather than just read and fed the information back to me, then you really shouldn't be at Oxford at all. That shook me, and I hope I did my best to try thinking for the next 3 years. I'm not sure how successful I was, but that certainly was the aim. Now, Indian universities, I'm going to suggest, and indeed many universities in the Western world as well, and in China, I think give a tremendous emphasis on communicating what's already there, rather than on creativity, on developing excellence, and excellence only comes out of creativity. Now, in addition, therefore, to domain-specific and domain-general skills, universities need to stimulate creativity. This can be developed within a creative environment. If everybody in your university thinks creatively, and when you say something, they say, are you sure? Where's the evidence? I've got a better idea. then you're going to get many new ideas. And if they say, oh yes, that's Mintzberg 1984, good, we'll copy that down. And what did Porter say? Good, we'll copy that down. You'll still get a good degree, but you haven't really added anything, have you? It involves thinking out of the box. Now, thinking out of the box is one of these cliches that, again, are developed by the media. Maybe even Friedman invented it, I'm not sure. But we know what it means. There's the box, and that's existing knowledge. If somebody throws a problem at you, let's look from there, or there, or there. It may not take us anywhere, but if we brainstorm something new, then it was worth sitting there. If we just recite what's already in the box, then it probably isn't. And that's best done, and most likely to be done, in a situation of tension, which new thinking can release. And tension means when we find ourselves unable to continue doing things in the conventional way that we've been doing them for a long time. If we're uncomfortable that we're actually giving any value added, there's a tension, and then creativity may come about. Now, as I've led up to saying, there are no Indian universities currently in the world top 200. Now, that's quite frightening. Possibly it's due in part to the protectionist attitude that's kept world-class universities out of India so that they can't compete on a level playing field. That's one thing. But another thing might have been the inherited British Raj idea of don't think too much, just do it. And you need this knowledge to do it. The three major league tables developers put much emphasis on research activity, and typically Indian universities do not. They also emphasize international faculty and students as very important. Teaching quality is given a relatively low emphasis in terms of international world top 200. I'm not saying that's right, but it is the case that is the case. In Oxford, for instance, you'll get too many dons saying, it's a wonderful university, except for the students. And I don't think that's funny, personally. I think teaching is very important. But nonetheless, in terms of becoming a World 200 player, you need to give a much greater emphasis to research and to publishing research papers. So, the skills needed to become a world-class university are not those emphasized in Indian higher education in general, and therefore they don't feed through to a position in the world table. My colleague and I have set up an organization called the International Academic Quality Consortium, and that's to inspect Indian universities and identify their strong and weak points by world standards, not by Indian standards, and not so that you can buy, if you like, a good position by paying money and saying, I will now be in a particular league table. In absolute terms, we need to do that by identifying the skills needed to establish creativity in a university, as well as the communication of knowledge, because the communication of knowledge is obviously also very important. Then we will present a report and develop a plan for the universities to develop the skills necessary to become world class. As a final point, I would like to announce that in Oxford at the end of August, 27th, 28th, 29th, we are holding a symposium on the higher education in the 21st century. And we are inviting people on a world basis to contribute papers, because we don't think we have all the answers. And we hope to get 50 or 60 of the best brains to be able to tease out where we should go in a global way in higher education over the next decade or two. It may be a bit of a grandiose project, but unless we do that, then we'll just carry on as we are at the moment. So I think my contribution to the skills conference is basically to say, yes, universities have to be vitally important in terms of helping develop the skills, both on a domain-specific and on a domain-general way, and to interrelate with industry to make sure that those skills are the ones that are really needed. But at the same time, those universities must have a banner on the top of the lintel going in, at least metaphorically, to the university to say, this is where you enter if you're concerned about excellence and you're concerned about creativity as well as the development of skills. Because only in that way can we actually keep up with the way in which technology is changing and develop a balanced economy that will increase the standards of living for everyone. Thank you.